I'd like to, first of all, welcome everybody to the PCC forum. For anybody who is not familiar, you can find us at pccforum.wordpress.com. It's basically a transdisciplinary lecture series hosted by the California Institute of Integral Studies. And so we're just encouraging contributions from across all of the different programs. And today we have a couple of esteemed professors. And to give a little introduction to these two professors, I'm going to call on Stefan Julik to say a little something. Stefan.
Great, thank you so much. I'm the program manager with East West, and I have the privilege of working with these two individuals. Just by way of introduction, Craig Chalquist is the former chair of East West Psychology here at CIIS and has recently returned from an administrative role at Pacifica Graduate Institute to rejoin us as core faculty. He's co-editor with Linda Bazell of the anthology Ecotherapy, Healing with Nature in Mind, the founding editor of Immanence, the Journal of Applied Myth, Story, and Folklore, author of several books studying the intersection of psyche, nature, place, and myth. His website, World Read Academy, is a rich online resource offering courses, webinars, consulting, and more to foster, as Craig puts it, the re-enchantment of how we live here on Earth as caring, conscious, and engaged citizens. So please visit his website. It's worldread.com, WORLDREDE. And that, as Craig says on the website, is from the Old English, meaning to interpret or to counsel. Debashish Banerji is the Haridas Chaudhuri Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures and the Doshi Professor of Asian Art at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He's also the program chair for East West Psychology Department and my boss. Prior to CIIS, he served as the Professor of Indian Studies and the Dean of Academics at the University of Philosophical Research in Los Angeles. His interests lie in postmodern, postcolonial, and cross-cultural approaches to Indian philosophy, psychology, and culture. Debashish has curated a number of exhibitions of Indian and Japanese art, including some here at CIIS. I believe that one is still up on the second floor, although nobody can visit it right now. He's authored and edited several books on major figures of the Bengal Renaissance, such as the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, the artist Abanindranath Tagore, as well as the spiritual thinker Sri Aurobindo. He's also edited books on critical posthumanism and on integral yoga psychology. Of late, he's been collaborating on writing projects with PCC's own Robert McDermott. The talk tonight is entitled End of Days or End of Days, D-A-Z-E, the last days, interpreting the archetype of the apocalypse. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Craig and Debashish.
Thank you so much. Thanks to PCC for hosting this event on behalf of both of us. What we plan today is to kind of bounce off each other a bit, and with me going first. So I have a little bit to say about the archetype of apocalypse, and then Debashish will come in with his comments, and then we'll just go back and forth a few times and develop this topic a bit and see where it takes us. And then we'll have time at the end for question and answer and discussion, if that will work for everybody. So I want to start by pulling up an image real quick here. So let me see if I can do that. All right, hopefully you can see that. So on to our topic, our light topic for the evening, the archetype of the apocalypse. So two highly charged words, apocalypse and archetype. And we won't be able to do full justice to either one in the course of the evening, but we do want to indicate a few points of departure for thinking about this. It will be apparent to everybody here that even though we didn't plan this in terms of the timing, we've been talking about doing this for some months now, but the timing is pretty apt. So I wanted to start by saying a little bit about that word archetype. And I'm not going to offer a technically accurate definition of it because it's defined all kinds of ways. And even in Carl Jung's work, he defined it different ways. And it's a term that goes far back into Western cultural history. So it's got all kinds of different ways to understand it. So I'm gonna give you the simplified version for purposes of what we're going to talk about. So my way of just thinking about it off the top of my head would be that an archetype is a recurring, gripping pattern of transition, a recurring, gripping pattern of transition with events of symbolic import. So let's have a specific example. And because of the timing, we've got one to talk about tonight, which is contagion, which might be an excellent example of the archetype of apocalypse. So as an example of this archetype, and I'll mention a couple of pieces to this as they show up, not just historically, but also in folklore, including myth and folk tales and things like that. Contagion is a pretty recurrent theme throughout history in all cultures, I think, and certainly in their mythologies. And when I was thinking about this tonight, I kept having this memory of something I saw in a film that I think sums up the current situation in some ways. And I'm thinking of the film The Hobbit and the character Bilbo Baggins. And both in the film and in the book, there's a scene in which he and the band of people that he's with on a journey, on an adventure, are about to move into a very dark forest called Mirkwood. And so this line actually occurs in the film, but not in the book. But the sense of it's the same in both. And so when Bilbo comes up to the edge of the forest in the film, he pauses for a second and he says, "This forest feels sick." And then he asks Gandalf, "Is there some way we can go around this?" Gandalf says, "No, I got to go right through, you know. That's what heroes are for, right?" So pandemics, plagues, different kinds of contagions tend to come up as a theme when the body politic is sick. And so in a way, they outwardly reflect something that's happening at the cultural and personal level as well. So I have two examples, one from fiction, another one from fiction, I should say, and then one from history. And then I'll talk a little bit about what does an apocalypse archetype actually look like, and then Debashish will present some things right after that. But so the one example that comes to mind, I've been reading recently a little bit of the beginning of Sophocles' play, King Oedipus. And at the beginning of that play, when the plague is just starting to take over Thebes, the king is arguing with people about who's at fault. And at the same time, he's using it as an opportunity to promote himself. So he's actually bragging in the play, you know, I'm the king, I'm Oedipus, everybody knows who I am. And meanwhile, people are just falling over with the contagion. And then he blames Tiresias and other people. Tiresias is a blind prophet. So the very people who see deeply into the situations are the ones that get blamed the most by the king. And it takes the oracle of Apollo to actually awaken people to the fact that it's the king who brought the plague. He's not so much cause and effect physically responsible, but the plague is a response to the fact that Oedipus is in charge of the kingdom. So that's a fictional example. An example from history, the year 430 BCE in Athens, there was a terrible plague that hit during the Peloponnesian War. And this was at a time when Athens, when the Athenian Empire actually was spreading out and doing a lot of conquering. And around the time when Pericles decided that it might be useful to the Athenian war effort to melt down the giant statue of Athena and use the money to pay for more expansion, he got sick. And so it ended up being something like a third of the city that died of that plague. So that's what I mean when I say that in terms of contagion as an expression of the archetype of apocalypse, they tend to recur not just in the presence of bad leadership. So it's not just a matter of like blaming the leader, but it's when the body politic itself is falling ill. So a few things about that word apocalypse, and then how this tends to play out over time, and then Debashish will speak. So apocalypse, if you look at the etymology, it literally means something similar to unveiling or uncovering or revealing something that was hidden. That's kind of what it's about. That's of the very nature of an apocalyptic event. And if you look through folk tales and what we in the West like to call myths, but which people elsewhere refer to as traditional stories or sacred stories, they don't tend to be, there's a few exceptions to this, but they don't, apocalypse doesn't tend to be a one-time only end of the world and that's it. They usually come in two phases. The first phase is a descent phase where everything falls to pieces. And then the second phase is a renewal phase. So in the beginning, when an apocalyptic event starts, particularly in myth and in other kinds of folklore, there's usually a beginning period where things feel like they're not quite right, and there's a lot of voices and other presences that are being pushed to the margins of culture and consciousness for a very long time. So there's a long prodromal phase, to use a somewhat clinical term, and then cracks in the reigning worldviews and as in the institutions that support them as well. So things start to reveal gaps, after which the collective mood shifts a little bit, and then more later, people start springing up to defend the status quo. And then everything comes to the surface as the ruling gods or principles or institutions start falling to pieces. And the term I've been using for that is apocalyptic failure. It means a systemic failure where things completely break down. So an apocalyptic event tends to play out that way, but as I mentioned, it's in two phases. So in some stories, as well as some historical periods, there's always a renewal phase. In most stories, there's a renewal phase at the end. So in the Norse mythology version of this, Ragnarok, there's a whole series of falls and collapses and, giants versus the gods and huge battles and all kinds of things that happen. The earth is ruined, but then at the end of it, the earth rises anew. And there's a period where new powers begin to walk the land. And there's a lot of imagery of renewal at the end of the Eddas. So two phases, a descent phase and then a rising phase. So more on that a little bit later. So Debashish.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. That was really revealing, actually. And, so talking about the end days, because often when we think about apocalypse, we think about it as the end days in that sense that it's really the first phase, as you're saying, of the two-phase renewal. But something comes into existence, something fossilizes, it becomes our world order, and then cracks appear in it. And then we have this sense of the end days. And the end days can be, localized, or they can be globalized. And that's what we are seeing today. We are seeing a kind of a globalized sense of the end days. And this has happened many times. So you're talking about mythology, you also talked about history, and you see it in different cultures, you see it in different regions. What we find is that humanity has turned this into a pattern that we've studied and we've given mythological understandings to in all cultures, and particularly in religions. And so we find, of course, the major one that many people talk about right now is the coming of the second coming, the coming of the second coming of the Christ, for example, because we live in a world that is still under the shadow of the colonization of Christianity, in a sense. So, we start thinking about the fact that everything is falling apart and we're looking for somebody to come. The idea of a savior, and this idea of a savior is in many cultures, actually. So we have, and then you have thinkers like W.B. Yeats, who was talking about this during the Second World War. He has this famous poem called The Second Coming. And it's couched in terms more of an antichrist there. It's the second coming, the being is slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. And he has that famous line there, which is oft repeated, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And that's exactly what, as you were describing the first phase, things falling apart, the center doesn't hold, the sense of the order, the wholeness is breaking down. And then they're, of course, looking for a second coming, somebody to come and save the people. So we find this in a number of cultures. We see this in Buddhism, for example. They talk about the age called a certain period called Mappo. It's all, Japan was thinking about this during the 17th century, where everything seemed to become anarchic. And then you had people come and put it back into order, but it was another kind of hegemonic order, So this happens, and the Indian very well-known sequence of yugas has to do with this. And so they're talking about not just one set of, breakdown and renewal, but 4 sets of them. And the idea is that the first one is called the Golden Age. It's the Satya Yuga, the age of truth. And it's really the age of the gods. So everything is perfect. The divinity is manifest in all things. But evidently something is not right, because it slips. There's a slippage. And the age fails. And something else comes in place, which is really a fall. It's no longer the original wholeness, but a slight diminution in which you have heroes now. So it's the Treta Yuga, it's 3/4 of the full orb of the circle. And during this period, what we find is that heroic figures abound. And in the Indian kind of cultural history, it's equated to the age of Rama, but the age of Rama fails with the Ramayana, which is really the great war with Ravana. There's something from the outside, which is just, not part of the perfect circle, and it invades. And as a result, there is a gradual breakdown, and the age of Rama also, of course, it begins with this war, but after that, the age of Rama also fails. And you have another age, and that ends up with the Mahabharata. It's the Dwapara Yuga, where you have half the truth. And the Mahabharata leads us to another failure, another cracking of the seams, and the coming of this great war, and another avatar figure. This is Krishna. And then you find that also sort of breaks down, and you slip further into our age, which is supposed to be the great darkness, Kali Yuga. And you find this bandied about quite a lot. Many people will tell you we are in the deep Kali Yuga, the densest night of Kali Yuga. And some people will say it's just going to get worse, and ultimately it will lead to a complete dissolution. And that's part of the mythology. One idea of the mythology is that before the renewal phase, there is a wiping out of the earth, that everything gets wiped out. In some of these Hindu myths, you get complete disappearance of everything, and a new age arises, as it were. But of course, there is a 4-phase cycle, and at the end of it, there is the complete wipeout after the Kali Yuga, and it begins again with a new Satya Yuga. But then you also have certain the texts that are talking about these are the Puranas. Some of them are saying you actually don't have a wipeout. What you have is the fulfillment of the entire cycle, and they call it the Krita Yuga, that is the fulfilled age. And so one of the ways in which people have tried to understand this is, of course, we always think about a savior, somebody who's going to come in the end, an avatar, And the final avatar, who's supposed to come at the end of the Kali Yuga, is like one of the horsemen of the apocalypse. Like, he comes on a horse, and he's the harbinger of truth, and he wipes out all the kind of majority of the earth and leaves only the beings who can, carry out the age of truth. But there's other ways of looking at this. And one of the ways that has been talked about in more recent times is Sri Aurobindo's version of this same kind of cycle. And he looks at it sort of like each failure, each fall in the circle, going from the full circle to the 3/4, half, and the end of the circle, as it were, is either a glass half full or a glass half, half empty. So we keep talking about the glass half empty version because we always look to the past as the perfect age. But he's saying there's another way we can look at it. And the fact that there is a fall from the age of the gods, that particular slippage that takes place at each fall, each age, is also a sign of something wrong there. And what's wrong is that there isn't enough individuality. So the word of the gods is perfect because, like the Taoists say, you don't know that you know. You act out the symbol without actually having any self-consciousness about it. And each time around, you have self-consciousness. But as soon as you have self-consciousness, you veer away from the symbol. You veer away from the archetype because you have choice. And so due to the choice, you now create a word which is more anarchic, that doesn't really hold to whatever there was as it's another image is the fall from the Garden of Eden. It's like a 4-stage fall from the Garden of Eden. Each stage is a little far from it. And so it feels as if it can't really be one with it. And so Sri Aurobindo, when he looks at it, he says that this is really a temporal structure. It doesn't occur necessarily only, in terms of ages, but it occurs even in terms of smaller time cycles. And we find it's like a fractal image in that sense. And so we find that there is something which is achieved, and it is really like a kind of a wholeness. And this wholeness is seen as a kind of a symbolic age. He uses the term symbolic age for the Satya Yuga because people are living out the symbol. They're perfectly embodiments of the symbols. And then you find the little drop that takes place brings you into a second age. That's the age of the heroes, no longer the age of the gods, but people who strive to become one with the symbol. And he calls that the typal age. And then from the typal age, there is an even greater fall. And now people find it really difficult to connect with the truth. And so they build conventions, they build laws, they build, what do you call them? Those commandments and law books, dharma shastras. And he calls this the age of convention, the conventional age. And even that creates its own bondage within the society, so that at a certain point, people want to break away from it. And that falls again. And now you have the age of individualism. And so in a way, he sees even a smaller version of this appearing in world history. If you look at European history, you see leading to modernity, you see what we call the Dark Ages. It's really the age of conventions. It's people believe in conventions to hold them together to religion. And then with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, you have that breaking up and you have the age of individualism. And we really see ourselves at the end of that age. The age of individualism has reached its greatest anarchic, individuality. And we really, the image of the human that we create is not being able to hold together the totality of the complex world that we find ourselves in. And so now we start thinking again of, is there a savior that's going to come? And what Sri Aurobindo is saying is that no, what has happened is an increased individuality, and the plurality of our individual world is actually a good thing, because ultimately it's really the whole that is present in the each one of us is really the whole exploring itself. And so instead of looking for another father figure or another God figure or another king figure, what we need to do is to find the whole within ourselves and build the whole together. So it's really the age of individualism for him moves into what he calls the age of subjectivism. In other words, we explore our inner lives. We enter into an inner exploration of the archetypes and of the inner terrain, the subjective terrain. And as we deepen into that, we start discovering oneness again. And that's a different kind of oneness. So it's a realized oneness. And that's why it's the Krita Yuga, the age of fulfillment. So this is one way in which we can see this cycle and the breakup and renewal that you were talking about. It requires a new kind of perspective. We need to own up, become responsible for that perspective. Otherwise, we will constantly be looking for a God. Heidegger, in his last interview in Der Spiegel, because when he was being really queried about his connection with the Nazi party, all he could say was only a new God can save us. So it's again that same thing. Of course, we can read it in two ways. The new God can be a new principle, but really it's looking for the savior again. I mean, he made one mistake with the wrong savior. Now you start looking for another savior. And I wanted to also read this thing from Gilles Deleuze, and you raised the whole issue of Oedipus Rex, and it's a very interesting passage that he has about the same kind of cyclic process. So he goes, he's talking about 3 stages. He says, we rediscover this theme of 3 temporal stages in most cyclical conceptions, such as the 3 testaments of Joachim of Flora, or the 3 ages of Vico, the age of the gods, the age of the heroes, and the age of men. The first is necessarily by default and as though closed upon itself. The second is open and witness to a heroic metamorphosis. But the most important and mysterious lies in the third, which plays the role of signified in relation to the other 2. Thus Joachim wrote, there are 2 signifying things and 1 signified. Pierre Bolange, who owes much to both Joachim and Vico together, attempts to specify this third age as that of the plebeian, of Ulysses, or no one, the man without name, the regicide, or the modern Oedipus, who searches for the scattered members of the great victim. So this is it, we are into the fragmented, but we are really into the fragmented because we are here to build the whole together by ourselves, by finding the whole within ourselves, not looking for a savior. So I think when we talk about apocalypse and the end days and these 2 cycles moving from the breakdown of the order and into a new order, I think we are at a very significant point, because it's no longer a new order which will be ruled by a new king, but we have to find that order within ourselves and build it. In that kind of an image can take us into something different than what we've been repeating again and again.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that Jung says something about this also, Craig?
I bet he does.
Tell us.
Let me grab an image here real quick.
Sure.
Let's see, where did I, here it is. All right. There's a picture of Jonah sheltering in place. And Couldn't resist. So I wanted to actually read you a statement that Jung made in his book, Aeon. Let's see. Oh, here we go. So has a lot to do with this. You'll notice too, as we go forward, that we're both emphasizing that the cycle itself, the underlying dynamics that drive this cycle of apocalypse and renewal, it's not something that can be averted, but there's various ways of dealing with it with different outcomes. And I think this quotation by Jung speaks to this. He says, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. And that's an emphasis that shows up in a number of Jung's writings, that when a situation is being constellated, when there's a need for deep change at some level, especially inwardly, and we don't meet that need, we ignore it, we go on with business as usual, what have you, we turn away from the path, turn away from the summons, then what tends to happen is eventually the situation shows up outside of ourselves. So then in connection with what we're talking about, instead of something that would be more of a social apocalypse or descent, or perhaps a psychological descent, then we have a literal one. And so instead of visiting the underworld in some other way, we actually turn the upper world into an underworld. So what I wanted to do is just mention a couple of dynamics that are involved in triggering a literal apocalypse when something like that happens, and then say a little bit about the alternative. So one thing that can trigger a literal apocalypse instead of an internal one is something that depth psychologists refer to as pseudo-innocence. Pseudo-innocence. I'm remembering a conversation I had with James Hillman after 9/11. And he had just visited the site. He had just come back from New York City, and he seemed pretty shaken up. And he talked about the devastation and the loss of life and things like that. And at one point I said, was there something about it? I heard something in his voice, and I said, was there something about it that especially bothered you? And he said, yes. What really bothered me was when I saw this enormous stack of teddy bears in front of this big pit. And his feeling was, this is the best we can do with this. This is a huge opportunity for reaching each other and reflecting and all kinds of other things. And this is the best we can do. And then he, at that point, started talking about how dangerous pseudo-innocence is, that innocence in children is one thing, but in adults, it's absolutely deadly. And it tends to constellate its opposite, which is disillusionment and disillusioning circumstances. So that's a trigger of literal apocalypse. Implied in this is hanging on to the customary, hanging on to things beyond the point where they're of any use anymore. Detachment from how we're being governed. You hear a lot of people say, I'm just not into politics. I just can't stand it. It's all blah, But of course, what that does is it leaves all the power politics decision to exactly the wrong people. The people who are ambitious, who are psychologically immature, and then they run the show. So when we give up our share in trying to decide how we're governed, that can lead to an apocalyptic situation too. Giving away our power to immature leaders is an example of that. Human supremacy and hubris. So thinking that we're actually outside of the natural order, or that we're masters of the natural order, which oftentimes prompts something from that realm to respond. I keep thinking of something that the California poet Gary Snyder said, which is, nature bats last. And then another factor is, and I'm thinking of the fact that I think the United States has a huge complex around this character, which is the character of the hero. The hero, when you look through the old stories across cultures, the hero and the monster tend to go together. And heroes are often held in other cultures not as beneficial figures necessarily, or especially not as wise figures. They're held as larger than life. They're held as dangerous. as monstrous. And so when you have in a story playing out a monster somewhere, then the hero usually shows up right after. And then when you have a hero by himself, then the monster tends to show up afterwards. So it's as though they're two sides of the same titanic psychology. So dealing with hero psychology, there's a part I'm reminded of by this in Jung's Red Book, which is, it came from his journals called the Black Books. In 1913, I think it was, he started really getting hit with internal visions, and his imagination and feelings were going crazy, and he began writing it all down, doing a kind of self-analysis. And the Red Book came out of that. It's calligraphy and paintings and interpretations of visionary material. And toward the beginning of the Red Book, there's a vision that Jung has in which a hero figure dies, and he helps kill it. And so there's a part in the commentary section where he says something like, if we don't sacrifice our heroic ego somehow and get it down to size, then we start sacrificing each other. And so this was 1 year, by the way, before the First World War broke out. So that's how he started to really think twice about that figure of the hero and whether it's really that beneficial a model or not. So the last point I'll make here, and actually a couple of points, is that the cure for that sort of heroism tends to be what Jung called the archetype of the Night Sea journey, which is the descent phase of the archetype of apocalypse. So there's lots of stories around the world where not just heroes, but other sorts of figures too, gods even, Dionysus and others, they have to make some sort of a journey to the underworld so that they can get kind of shrunk down to size and transformed. And that offers an archetypal model and a mythic model for how we might deal with things like this, to make the descent in a more conscious way so that we don't have to make it so destructively and so literally. So I'll have more to say about that later. But last point is that also throughout folklore, when apocalyptic times do come up, there's often a range of outcomes. So in the Popol Vuh that the Mayan stories appear in, there's actually different phases of apocalypse. It reminds me a little bit about what Debashish was talking about earlier, where it's not just one, but there's a whole series of cycles. And the last group of beings to be subjected to apocalyptic happenings are what the Popol Vuh calls the wooden people. And these are people who don't remember the gods or their divine origins, and they ignore nature. And so there's a part in that story where the natural world starts fighting back against them. And so rocks fly up off the ground and hit them, and even their tools. When Debashish was mentioning Heidegger, I was thinking about his whole thing about ready to hand and hammers and stuff like that. Even the hammers start hitting people, you know. They go on their houses and the houses collapse on top of them. So in that particular story, it's not a good outcome for the wooden people. They all get wiped out by the earth. And then the Mayan gods get together and they say, well, maybe next time we should try using corn instead of wood, you know. But every story is different. And so what that suggests to me is something, again, that Debashish was emphasizing earlier, that there's a choice in this. You know, when things start to descend, how are we going to show up for that? That's the question that keeps coming up. And how we show up consciously determines a lot of how it actually plays out on the stage of the world, as well as in myth and folklore.
Yeah, quite true, Craig. And you know, in a way, what you were saying about exteriorizing things or suppressing things and then that getting exteriorized is really the cycle that we're through. And even the image of the human that we've created ourselves in. And so today we find this new discipline called posthumanism that's gaining ground. And it's really not about, you know, so there's two versions to it. Many people think posthumanism is actually, increasing your capacities through gadgets and through prosthetics, electronic prosthetics, being able to upload your consciousness into a machine and things like that, becoming an android of some kind. And that's really taking this image of the human to its extreme. because the image of the human is, and when we talk about posthumanism, we have to understand it in terms of something beyond the image of the human that we occupy right now. And that goes back to the Renaissance and then really the Enlightenment. And it's that same cycle, the fall from the Dark Ages, or rather what we want to look at as the rise from the Dark Ages into a certain kind of freedom, a renaissance, a rebirth of early Greek humanism, which is man as the center of all things, the measure of all things. And essentially, this is a replaying of certain Abrahamic views of the privileged, exceptional position of the human on the earth. And so we build a civilization around that image. And it's an image that sort of subordinates the earth, subordinates nature, subordinates other races and people, subordinates women. And so you have this masculine patriarchal image of the human that occupies our entire age and becomes full formed in our times, in modernity, which is really through the power of technology. I think technology, we define ourselves through our progress, which is taking place by the power of technology. The human as the homo faber, the maker of tools. And we come to a point where we've really broken ourselves off from all these other larger realities to which we belong. And so we find that, one way in which we can think about the image of the human, and particularly when it comes up in the Renaissance, it's a little more subtle. There's more elements to it. There's more heart to it, one may say. But by the time it transitions to the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, it's changed into a really heady thing. It's become the rational being. The human is defined in terms of its rationality. And we start using our rationality to create a perfect world, because the human is seen to have the reasoning that God put into the perfect machine. So we use the mechanism or the power of mechanism to tinker with the world and make it perfect. And we create a certain type of a world order, which is a rational order. And so ordering is, I think, really the quintessence of the human as a rational being, because that's what the mind does best. It creates order. It creates classifications. It creates classificatory systems. It tries to build a system, a systemic view, which will hold everything together. And even in terms of disciplines, just like we're talking about posthumanism, there is a certain version of systems theory, which tries to, build of course, there's different types of systems theory. There's also chaos theory, which connects with systems theory. But then a certain view of the systems theory is to build a perfect system through the interlocking disciplines to come up with a single image of the whole world and the human being in it that is constructed by the mind. So ordering is one of the central paradigms of the image of the human. And along with it, there's two ways in which ordering works. In one sense, it works in an epistemological fashion, kind of the understanding of order as a knowledge construct, a system of knowledge. But it also works in a political fashion, as when we say, or a colonial fashion, as when we say we order people about, we order things about. We put them in their place through our commands. That's order in that sense. And the two are actually the same thing. Ordering as a knowledge construct is really technologically converted into ordering as a political construct. And so we order the other, which is all the things that we've put outside ourselves. We try to subjugate and exploit those things to derive a certain benefit, because we feel empowered and privileged to be the master of the system. And we find that these things which we have exteriorized or which we've suppressed come back with a vengeance, because we can't think of ourselves as outside that system. We are part of it. Either we have to see ourselves as a fragment of it, or we have to enlarge ourselves in such a way that we feel that the entire thing is within us. We have to, in a sense, expand our personalities to become one with the world. And so that's where we come to ideas of the post-human as, on the one hand, a deconstruction of the human as we've constructed it right now, but on the other hand, a going beyond the human, not by prosthetics, but by the enlargement of our consciousness. Can we form relations with nature? Can we form relations with the cosmos? Can we form relations with other realities to such an extent that that relation becomes an identity at a certain level? Or can we recognize both the relational and the identity aspects of the world that we dwell in? And I think that also forms part of what we are talking about in terms of that transition, of actually being able to shepherd that transition during the breakdown of this order that is the order of the human, ordering itself into existence and into something new or something else. On to you, Craig.
Let me grab a picture here. I got this from NASA. It's the new Earthrise image. So what often happens during these apocalyptic times is that new forms of organization are preceded by symbols that spring up right from the cracks and crevices of rupture. Some new vision, some new way of thinking about things or feeling things or doing things arises. And so an example of that for me will always be, in some ways, the space program, which on the one hand was a colonial operation. NASA used to say, they used to dare to say that they were going to colonize space. If you have any idea how vast the visible universe is, you realize that's a ludicrous concept. We can't even see all of it. The light hasn't even got to us from the full universe since the Big Bang. That's how large it is. So on the one hand, spaceflight has been a thoroughly colonial operation. They went to the moon and put a flag up there. And yet, even in the midst of that, there were astronauts writing poetry, and they were saying things like, wow, I thought I was up here to walk on the moon, but what actually happened was I looked back at the Earth. And these are astronauts from many different countries. There was one, Taylor Wang, who said that looking at Earth reminded him of a Chinese fairy tale where a group of men who are intending to rob a princess, a wise and beautiful princess, instead become her protectors. And they were saying all these deeply moving things about the experience of looking at Earth. So some years ago, I was giving a presentation on all of this at Prescott College, and it was open to the public. So there was a group of people from the town that were there. And one of the things I've had to learn over the years as a presenter is that I can't tell if the person in the front row or anywhere who's grimacing at me hates my presentation or has some other experience of it. So there was this kind of grizzled looking guy in his maybe mid 60s who was just kind of like, you know, and I thought, oh, I bet he hates it, you know. So at the end of the presentation, he was one of the people who came up to talk to me. And I thought, okay, now I get to hear about how terrible it was and, you know, how he disagrees with this and disagrees with that, you know. And he said, I'm Colonel so-and-so. And he held his hand out and he said, I built the engines of Apollo 8. My team built those engines. And we were just lifted out of ourselves when those images of Earthrise came back from space. We had no idea what we were doing until we saw those. And then it had this bigger meaning for us. And I was really moved by the power of inspiration and vision that even in the heart of something like what they were doing, even in the heart of mechanism and colonizing and all the rest of it, still managed to leak out and start changing consciousness, putting it on a different path. So I wanted to mention too that there's a word I've been playing with for a number of years now. And we all know that the word revolution it kind of means a change of not just governments, but ruling powers or ruling principles. One group of people's in charge, then there's a revolution, and then there's another group in charge. And the hope is always that they're going to do better than the previous group and not turn into more of the same, you know. But there's other kinds of changes you notice when you work a lot with people psychologically, where sometimes the change is superficial, which is one of the reasons that Freud used to joke that, as they used to call him, when one of his patients had a new insight, Freud would say the first thing they do is they turn it to the service of their old neurosis. So that happens. But there are deeper changes that take place too. So I started playing with this word trans-revolution, beyond revolution. And I was thinking of it more as when a system finds a new guiding image or vision, and then it begins rewriting itself from the inside out. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it changes the entire system or that it's at some point complete. So there's a number of these that are happening, and I jotted a few examples down. So for instance, the women's movement, sometimes it can be internal. So when a personal revelation starts rewriting your entire life and then you live differently, outwardly, you know, of course, the civil rights movement, the ecological revolution. I'm thinking of Wangari Maathai's work in Kenya specifically, and then Vandana Shiva from India. The integral approach itself might constitute a trans revolution that's still going on. All of these are still going on. And then the word Renaissance has been used several times. So there's throughout history. So there's the Bengali Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, the Islamic Renaissance. And those tend to leave something different, even when the burst of creativity or innovation or whatever it is, it glows for a while, then it fades a little bit, but there's still a permanent change. It's not, things are not the same as they were before. So those might be examples too. So all of this, I'll address this momentarily, but all of this raises the question for me, if we're in a state of trans revolution during this descent into wherever it is that we're going, how can we undertake this underworld journey together?
Yeah, very beautiful, Craig. And I think what you bring up, I think, is at the center of this, the need for new images. I think that's one of the first things. How can we develop a new vocabulary of images as ideals that we can move towards? And the Earthrise image is certainly something like that. You know, trans revolution, even in terms of what one might call new spiritualities. And I think you might be addressing a little later the whole idea of terror spirituality, because I think that the Earthrise image is something like that. It invites the whole world, irrespective of whether they believe in some particular mythological god or not, to express a certain numinous emotion and experience that in this earth. They experience it from beyond and they experience it from within. I wanted to also bring up an image like that, which is related to older mythologies, because I think we also are in a time when we need to revise our older mythologies, see them in a new light. The light that we are talking, a trans-revolutionary light, a light of a new renaissance. And one of these is the Vedic image of the sun god. So there is the myth of the mother of the suns. So in the Veda, there are many suns, you know, S-U-N-S, but there are also S-O-N-S of this mother goddess. Her name is Aditi. Aditi literally means the indivisible one, the undivided one. So she is the one being, and she's female, and she gives birth to 7 sons. And these sons, each one is born from her head, and it rises up, ascends into the sky. And then she gives rise to the 8th son. And this one is called Martanda. Martanda literally means dead egg. And it drops down. Instead of going up, it falls down and it's dead. It really is the egg of death. So in other words, it's the basis of what we call mortality, of death. And the idea behind it in a sense is this, that, and this is the revisionary idea of Martanda, is that it is our earth. Our earth is really a sun, but it is a sun that's coated over with the image of death. And it tries to give birth to its true sun-like nature through its evolution. And it comes to a certain point where we can birth the sun, which it really is, and which really glows in all of us. The sun, which is the image of the inner divine that's actually glowing inside each of us. And we are being invited to give it birth, to make the sun what it really, make the earth what it really is. And so an image that goes into the center of a new community, which Sri Aurobindo and the mother founded, called Auroville, is known as the Mother's Temple, Matri Mandir. And this is what it looks like. Let's see if I can raise it through our share screen facility. Does it come up? Didn't come up.
Maybe if you double click on it.
There's a small image of it.
Let me see if I can. One sec. Okay, there you go. Can you see it? Is it up?
No, it's only a tiny image, Debashish.
Okay.
When you share, it might be the case that you need to share the specific like browser or.
When you share, you have to open the image first on your desktop and then share.
Okay, let me try that.
Open it on your desktop.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. Let me try that. Does it come up now?
There it is.
Okay, so as you can see, it's like a golden orb that is rising from the earth. It's breaking the surface of the earth and rising up. And this is really the sun, which is at the center of the earth, which is making its rupture and coming out and, in a sense, deifying the earth. And so this is another image just to talk about images of this kind, which can be inspirations. And we need a whole constellation of such images to guide us into a new kind of a future, the trans revolution that Craig is talking about. I also wanted to look at what are the kinds of changes that we need to make. And I think we need to also talk about how, as an academic institution, CIIS can help, or other institutions can help in pushing this process forward and making this process happen, to people who are interested in understanding the process. And I think some of the things that we need to think about are, Craig talked about a number of these revolutions. We need to enter into a new relationship with the earth. We enter a new relationship with the whole of reality. We need to enter into new relationships with our cultures, different cultures, give them the place that they really deserve in our lives, not keep them segregated or belonging in a sense to different cultures or different histories, and in a sense be responsible for world history. Each of us is really called today to become responsible for the entire history of the earth taking place through our own lives. So we are world citizens in that sense, even if we grew up in a certain culture. And we need to move towards a new kind of definition of the earth and of our living environment, which has less of a footprint on the earth. We've created these cities and these living habitats which completely overpower the earth and destroy it. Instead, we need to build holistic habitats in which we can develop a new kind of life. And finally, I'd like to say that what we need is a new sense of purpose in life. And the new sense of purpose is not had just by being some kind of a tool in corporate life, in trying to build products for the world market. Right now, we've entered modernity is a phase of the marketization of the world. We all exist only for the world market, in producing and consuming for the world market. But instead, if we have a new purpose of becoming, are we becoming something greater than ourselves? I think we give full form to that notion of posthumanism. Posthumanism is firstly a deconstruction of the idea of the human, which has taken birth in the European Renaissance. We need to firstly provincialize that idea. It comes out of some particular history, but it has now occupied the earth. Instead of that, we need to have plural ideas of the human, and we need to have goals of becoming, so that we can move towards something that each of us finds meaningful in outgrowing our own limitations. And so I think these are some of the ways in which we can have that transition, and we have to become responsible for it as individuals. Now, the question is, how do we do that, and what are the institutional forms that can aid that? And maybe the university is one of those forms if we give it that particular content. And I'll turn it over to Craig at this point.
Thanks so much, Debashish. I'm bringing up an image that we use for something that we refer to as enchantivism, which has to do with telling stories that come out of situations of rupture, but making sure that the stories are more spacious than the difficulties that gave rise to them. So more about that in a second. I thought to put together, I started on a list of, in support of what Debashish just said, how do we move forward with all this? And putting it a little bit differently, how do we get through the Night Sea journey together? That's way too big a topic for one person to take on, let alone to do it for a gathering like this. So I just wanted to mention a few of the things that stood out for me. So one of them was letting go of failing institutions. Really letting go of them. I mean, really understanding internally at an emotional level that this way of doing things doesn't work anymore. So as an example, also as an example of how these institutions always try to convince you that they're necessary, I decided some time ago, but was only recently able to do this, mostly because of my own internal limitations. I decided that I wanted to withdraw as much energy as I could from big agriculture, the kind that's devastating entire regions of the planet and slaughtering animals and using fabulous amounts of water that we need for other purposes. So I became a vegan, and I was surprised at how easy it was. It's tricky in the sense that, I'm still looking at things that I eat and reading the labels and going, oh, I can't have this, you know. But it's not restrictive. It's in the sense of you don't know what to eat or any of that. You just have to be alert to what people try to sell you, you know. But I was really surprised at how easy it was, and I felt a lot better about doing it. So you can go online and read about it. I mean, there's all kinds of repercussions for doing something like that, positive ones. So that's like an everyday revolution you can do in your own kitchen. Things like, you know, welcoming what has been cast out of collective consciousness. So entertaining new ideas that are based on, some of which are based on some of the old patterns and the old stories, but reinterpreted the way Debashish was talking about. And an example that I always like too, I teach Gnosticism, and so there was a group of people a couple of thousand years ago who didn't like their institutions. They were a group of, and there was some overlap here, but there were Egyptians who had some problems with their religious forms of the time. There were Greeks who felt that their gods had basically been turned into literature, so what good were they? And then there were Jews who had a problem with the huge emphasis on purity and doctrine and things like this. And so these groups of people, sometimes all three were the same person, particularly in cosmopolitan places like Alexandria. They redreamed their mythology. So for them, figures like Eve are not passive. They're actually active messengers of light who are of a lineage that's ultimately divine. And it makes me wonder sometimes what would have happened if we had grown up, those of us who grew up Christian, had grown up with that version of Eve rather than the one that we heard about. So redreaming stories, that's part of enchantivism too. Reconnecting with the natural world, there's all kinds of things happening with that these days. Reinventing energy and transport, that's being done. All of these highly positive things are happening already. It's, in some ways, it's just a matter of connecting them to each other and scaling them up, strengthening community. And sometime, perhaps about a year from now, there's a group of us, both in East-West psychology and then some people outside like Linda Bazell, my friend and colleague, who are putting together an online conference on eco-spirituality. So there's a little piece of the puzzle too. And one of the premises that we're bringing into the work as we make it just a huge collection of diverse voices that'll stretch out over an entire year, emphasizing nature practices that actually put us back in touch with the intelligent presence of Earth. And we're emphasizing that the sense of the sacred, plants, animals, landscapes, everything, is a baseline for humanity, that it's an abundance-based spirituality. In some ways, it's a post-belief spirituality that anyone can access. So we're gonna have people come from many different places to talk about that and share practices. So there's an example. And then finally, to kind of pull it all together, I sometimes think about this in the context of an approach of fourfold caring. So caring about the self, self-care, so meditative practices of the kind that we teach all over the place at CIIS, also breathing practices, somatic practices, psychotherapy, coaching, things like that. Ways of taking care of yourself through all of this. I'm getting emails from KQED looking for stories on how meditation can help us deal with quarantine and confinement. So care of self is one part of it. Care of each other. We have to look out for each other. Huge numbers of people are being left behind in terms of resources. That's been true for a long time, but it's being emphasized by enormous disparities of not only resources, but pay and other things that are happening now that the coronavirus is bringing to the surface. And as Debashish was mentioning earlier, no one's going to save us from all that but ourselves. If an apocalyptic situation is a form of collective initiation, you have to get through it by helping each other. There's not going to be heavenly cavalry helping us with this. So care of the self, care of each other, care of Earth, so some of the nature reconnective pieces that we've been talking about. And then the fourth one that I would add would be care of the imagination in the sense of relearning how to dream together. So possibilities like Auroville is one of many. What sorts of community do we want that we would actually find inclusive and just and diverse and enjoyable and delightful to live in? Maybe it's time to experiment a little bit with that. Happens in small pockets all over the place. So again, how can we reconnect all of those? So those might be some things to get us going with this.
Yeah, and I'd like to mention, Craig, you brought up politics earlier. And I think from the tenor of what you're saying, I'd like to emphasize the idea of micropolitics. Because normally when we think about politics, and right now we are in the center of it, I think a lot of people in California are really despairing that Bernie Sanders has pulled out of the race, presidential race.
Yeah.
And we're in a very bad situation with our national politics right now. And so people, they constantly look to a great leader to actually help us. But perhaps the reason why all this is happening is to turn our gaze back on ourselves. What we need to think about first is micropolitics rather than macropolitics. And micropolitics begins where we are. It's just like you were saying, it's the little decisions that we make in our own lives which are political. Everything that we do has political import. And it can happen with an individual, but it can grow out of from the individual into little communities. And taking responsibility for ourselves and our own governance as communities is, I think, one of the ways in which we can move into that new space, which is no longer a space of looking for some political leader to put us in some kind of perfect place. Of course, we do need some proper, governance that will allow for equality to manifest. Because only under those conditions can we actually have micropolitics. So the two go together. I'm not saying that we have to wish away macropolitics, but I'm saying that we really need to pay a lot more attention to micropolitics, both at the individual level and at the smaller community level. And micropolitics has another aspect to it. One of the aspects is just taking right decisions with regard to what are the forces around us and what we need to empower politically in our own lives. But the other aspect, even in terms of small communities, like let's say a university community, is collective governance. And as far as collective governance goes, the whole idea with micropolitics is how can we turn it intuitive? How can we move it from, again, a mind-based rational process or vote-based process, which is only a question of numbers, to where we really hold each other as ourselves, where we actually come to true understanding of even a small community, that nobody gets left out. We care for each other, as you said. And I wanted to, in that respect, put up a quote, again, from the mother of Sri Aurobindo Ashram, that speaks to this, and it speaks to this with regard to Auroville, but it can be held as with regards to all of us as an ideal of consciousness and of post-human consciousness. She says, a Gnostic or supramental community, and we don't need to be hung up with those words, it's just a spiritual community, can exist only on the basis of the inner realization of each of its members, each one realizing his real concrete unity and identity with all the other members of the community. That is, each one should feel not like just one member united in some way with all the others, but all as one within himself. For each one, the others must be himself as much as his own body, and not mentally and artificially, but by a fact of consciousness, by an inner realization. So this is, even to think about something like that, takes us into a different, kind of vision of what it means to be human. And I think that's where we need to go. We need to push the boundaries of what is possible for us. And that brings me to academics. And I think, with CIIS, with things like East-West psychology, that is one of the things I feel we ought to put our attention to, what are the other psychologies, not just the psychologies that have been developed in the West as a result of trying to cope with the modern world, but what are the psychologies that help us to attain oneness that is greater than our boundaries? How can we enter into deeper relationship? How can we make that night journey or the underground journey that ultimately connects us to all things? So I think training in that direction, opening up the doors for those possibilities is one of the things that new academic enterprise can move towards. The other direction, I think, is to help people recognize that they need to find self-confidence and become new leaders of this transition. And that is a new kind of skill. We have to not only give people knowledge, but we have to give people practical skills to be able to actually become consultants, become leaders of communities, and be confident enough to stand on their own feet in a new vision that is no longer being supported by the world that's cracking up at its seams. So I think those are some of the things we can do.
Mm-hmm. So I have one last picture for all of you, and just a thought so that we can wrap this up. As Debashish knows, we've had some conversations in the East-West about these issues, and we ask questions like, what would a new kind of psycho-spiritual mentor look like? Our program is not a licensing program, so we're not in that particular paradigm, and we're not saying that it's not a useful one, but for those of us who don't work there, or in my case, don't work there anymore, what would that be like? The new psycho-spiritual mentor who can actually see in these terms during a time of night sea journey and all the other things that we've got coming down the pike for some time now as a result of our own actions on this planet. And also, what would it look like to train people for jobs that don't yet exist, but that will be needed? So those are some of the things that we've talked about. So a few last thoughts to take with you before we do question and answer a bit. I think of all this sometimes in terms of 4 big tasks that are waiting for us. And of course, there's many more. If only there were 4, right? But to mention a few that I think are especially important. The first one both of us have talked about more than once tonight, which is to actually take personal responsibility for making a difference in the world. There's a scene that I really like from one of the Dune books, Children of Dune, where there's a preacher who comes in from the desert every day into the city, and he preaches about their apocalyptic situation and the corruption of power and people going hungry and things like this. And there are people in the group who are listening who want a savior, who want a Messiah or a Mahdi. And in fact, at one point, a woman calls out, speaking for a number of people who were there. She raises her hands and says, "Mahdi, save us." And so the preacher, although he's blind, points his finger directly at her, and he says, "You are the only help that remains." So really getting that it's up to us. I think that's a first big task. Second, to outgrow what is dying. There's an operation in alchemy, which I think most of us realize is a lot more than a vulgar attempt to make gold out of lead. It was also a wisdom tradition for thousands of years in many cultures, Egypt, China, Europe, other places. And there's a European alchemical term that I've always liked called terra, T-E-R-R-A, damnata. And it means the part of the alchemical operation that it was necessary at one point, but if you leave it in the container for too long, it spoils the entire mix. So knowing what to get rid of in terms of the mix, including our mix of ideas about what actually works in the world. So that's the second task, to outgrow what's dying. Third, to learn, as I mentioned earlier, how to dream together. That's the first step in moving together. And then fourth, to get to work, to actually do this and not just talk about it. So I want to finish with a quotation by my friend and colleague Linda Bazell. The redesign of every sector of society to be compatible with the rest of nature and nature's laws is the great work of our era. So Debashish, anything else you want to say before we do Q&A?
No, I think that's a good point to end, and I think we can open it up for questions and answers.
All right, great.
And I know people are probably not in positions to talk, so you are welcome to either sort of grab the mic, or you can type your question in the little chat box, in which case I will.
Linda Bazell, and I'll type her name into the chat so you have it. The redesign of every sector of society is to be compatible with the rest of nature and nature's laws is the great work of our era. I think I have that written down. If I can find it real quick, I'll put it in the chat as well so you can have it. Ah, here it is.
I don't know that this is a question. It's more like a topic that one or both of you might be willing to address. And that is both of your presentations and the quotations and the language of the quotations were all unrelievedly masculine.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if either of you has an idea that the rescue mission, the savior, the transformative energy or spiritual power might be the feminine in some forms, Sophia or the mother, or communities of women. That seemed not to have been in the presentations in an explicit way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I thought I did mention the mother, and also Aditi, the mother of the gods, the mother of the suns. And, you know, I think the feminine power, I think we've been talking about that, the earth power really being a feminine power. And that's, in a sense, the image of the human as being a masculine image. It's a patriarchal image, and which has left out the feminine, component. And I think re-evaluate or coming into relationship with that and re-identifying with that is certainly part of it. And in talking about a savior figure, it's not so much a particular figure, but I agree with Craig that it's each one of us that really has to make that change, embody that force, that power. And it's really up to all of us to do it. Craig?
Yeah, well said. I agree. Yeah. We need, as we both mentioned, we need many voices and not just two guys talking about all this. Many voices. Yeah, sure. That's one way I find Jung very limiting. He had a lot of emphasis on hyper-individualism, as we would now call it. And he didn't think much of groups and gatherings of people, but it seems clear that to get through a Night-Sea journey, we need a highly diverse plurality of people all relating to each other in a humane way.
Actually, interestingly, just as we were talking about the fractal nature of the time units, the time period of Jung, which is also the time period of Sri Aurobindo and all these people, is really a very individualistic period. It seems to be that period of the heroes.
Yeah.
And I think we've moved out of that now. And I think it's really our call now to be plural, to be communities, to find the truth in groups and in many voices. I think that's the transition, in a sense.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I really think we need to have the feminine in order to balance what has been primarily masculine, so it becomes, we bring in needs to be nurtured for the earth, what needs to be nurtured in ourselves that has been left out because we've had to just listen to the straight line of the male idea of just going straight to wherever it is, and leaving out this nurturing, mothering, caring, for ourselves and for the world. It's the way I feel.
Yeah. Yep.
I feel like it would really heal our souls and our nature.
Very true, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Alka has a question. Debashish or Craig, can you see?
Well, actually, I had a comment. Thank you first for your question, Robert. And I really appreciated the point that someone brought about, the need for the feminine to bring balance. But I want to add that, in a lot of mythologies, the feminine is not just a nurturing mother, right?
Yeah.
She's also the fierce protector.
Yep.
Who will rise up in a righteous anger to set what's right. So I think we also need that sort of Kali energy, and I see that that's also coming up, through the Me Too movement, as well as, it's been coming up for decades, if not longer, with the women's movement. I think we need that sort of fierce feminine energy, and I think we're seeing it as part of the shift to a new way of.
Absolutely, yeah, true, Alka. Yeah, as you know, in the Indian tradition, you have two lineages of the feminine. You have the nurturing lineage, and you have the fierce lineage, and they're known as the Kalikula and the Shrikula. And integrating the two has been part of the tantric system. They've tried to integrate the two into pantheons of 10 goddesses, or Durga as one goddess that includes all of them, etc. But I think in society, we've kind of given a sort of, different image to the woman. But I think this is a time when the entire, integral power of the feminine needs to be manifest. And I think it can be manifest through femininity and also through each individual.
Could it have, what's happening now as far as the earth drying out and fires and things like that could be the feminine side, expressing itself in major earth events like major fires and, the melting of the ice caps. And, all this is going to put, it's threatening humanity because, we have not been taking care of nature. We haven't been, doing the right thing, tearing all the trees down. It's changing the process by which the earth can renew itself and, create more oxygen in the air. We need the trees, we need the plants to create more oxygen in the air.
There's a group that my friend Linda runs called Eco Psychology. It's a group in Facebook. It's got about 9,000 members now, and people are just joining pretty much every day to talk about these things. And the coronavirus has also come up because it's not separate from these other ways in which we've been exploitive toward the natural world. And so there's been different angles on it. Most of them emphasize keeping in mind the massive amount of human death and loss that's involved in that, not glorifying the virus by any means or anything, but also recognizing that it's saying something to us. And so I think one of my favorite of the memes that's come up that Linda posted was, she was half joking when she said this, but she said, I think that Gaia just sent us all to our rooms so that we would think about how we're behaving toward her, so.
Hi, everyone. It's Sami here. Hi, Craig. It's good to see you.
Yeah.
So thanks, Debashish and Craig, for your talk. There are many things that, obviously I resonate with. I would sort of put it differently, as a sort of coherent whole. But I suppose, I mean, there's lots of things that come up and there's lots of things that I wanted to say, but I just want to start, or just maybe this is all I'll say is, you know, what if we didn't know what we need to do, you know, because I mean, all my life I've been hearing people say we need to do this, we need to do that, and I've not seen it happen, you know. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, if anything, this should just humble, you know, as it humbles me, you know, that, I mean, we don't really know, right? I mean, I think we can use this as an opportunity to really empty out everything that we think we know, you know. And as far as this whole idea of savior is concerned, I keep hearing this, right? Like, we don't need to look to that, we don't need to look to that. But in that, I see a kind of psychological problem, you know, in constantly saying that. Because I think that, you know, I don't know if, you know, if we even need saving. Like, what is that whole concept of being saved? Saved from what? You know, is a very good question. And so I think the entire premise is wrong. I mean, this is just my, you know, immediate hit is, I don't think we need saving. So I don't think we need a savior, right? But it's obviously not one or the other. It's far more involved, and this is what I'm working on for my dissertation. So, you know, I'll have probably something more, you know, well put together to offer. But for now, I just wanted to say that and just get your, you know, feedback and response.
Thank you for that. One of the things I love about storytelling is that stories get at some of the complexities that straight up, you know, speaking or debating or offering solutions or whatever don't get at, which is why when I do make some recommendations, I always try to keep it flexible and tentative. But the thing about storytelling and telling new kinds of stories, including ones that are based on old stories being revisioned, is that they're better at capturing complexities than our verbal logic tends
Absolutely.
to be.
Yep.
So I think that if we can do that in the humility that a dissent brings us, I think we'll be in a better position to have a sense of how to proceed.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, Sami, it's very interesting what you say about ignorance, the fact that that's really our condition. And I think to recognize that is really important.
Yep.
I was reminded of a meeting where the Dalai Lama was sitting with some scientists and some Buddhists, you know, from various places. And he asked the question to the Buddhists. He said, what unites all Buddhists? And they started giving answers like, oh, we don't believe in any God. We don't believe in the Atman, etc.
Right. Yeah.
And then he said, you know, none of that is true. He said, I've met Buddhists who believe in the Atman.
Sure.
And so then he looked around at the whole room and he said, there's only one thing that unites all of us. And that's the fact that we are all ignorant.
Yeah.
You know, the recognition of that is a very powerful thing. I mean, that's at the center of the Socratic, you know, recognition as well. Identification of his own wisdom was the fact that he knew that he was ignorant.
Yeah.
And I think that prepares it's like a chalice. It's the empty space into which truth can come, into which intuition can come, into which something that is dynamic can unfold. And so it's a transition. It's just like Craig was saying, we are in a transitioning period.
Yeah.
And we can have directions in which we can move. But it's not, if we are going to talk about knowledge, then we're again creating a certain image, an image of thought, which can never really hold everything together and which will end up with another breakdown.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Debashish and Craig, thank you so much for this talk. It was really inspiring. So Debashish, you said that you know, we need a new sense of purpose. We don't need more corporate individuals to build new products for the market. But I'm wondering, because the market is so deeply embedded in our world, is there a way for us to sort of bring a spiritual dimension to the market rather than sort of pushing it aside and demoralizing it and having this sort of personality of wanting to destroy the market?
Well, firstly, I don't think we can destroy the market. It's here to stay, and in the sense that it's too big. It's not too big to fail, but it's cracking at the seams, but it's going to patch itself together again. So what I was suggesting is alternative ways of being. The market will continue. And yes, I agree with you that you have to look at the market as also a very plural entity. There's many different kinds of corporations. There are corporations that may be open to transformation. And there are other corporations that will be only open to what's called greenwashing. When the entire sort of, onus is put on corporations, they build a certain defense mechanism, which is what greenwashing is. They make you believe that they're good. They'll sell you cigarettes, but they'll also put up these musical, institutions. So it's always that kind of thing that's done. But apart from that, there is a conscious business that's possible. Communities that want to live in a more conscious way also have to find a way by which they interact with the world market. They can do it in a more conscious way, but there is a certain kind of, collective governance and a responsible way by which one can enter into that relationship. And it's a relationship, and it's a kind of a, transformative relationship that is not going to change overnight. But certainly there has to be an attempt that's made, both from an alternative place as well as from within the establishment.
Debashish and Craig, I just want to say massively huge thank you for this. This was beyond what I could have imagined as wonderfully happening. And it's just, thank you for all of your insightful points and wisdom. I don't hear any of the ignorance there, I just want to say. But of course we all are. I would love to see this conversation continue. I'd love to see, some more practical comments. I think, Somi, you've helped us head in that direction a little bit, with spiritualizing the market and products and so forth. I loved a lot of your practical ideas, and including what happens at CIIS. I'd love to hear us talk about that. I want to add one little spiritual thought from a different tradition that wasn't represented here. One of the ways I work with myself and with clients, and I have to do stuff with myself first before I do it with clients, is drawing on the Hawaiian Huna tradition and the Ho'oponopono, or the Hawaiian prayer. Of course, I don't know how many, Hawaiian prayers, but the Ho'oponopono. And I don't know if people are familiar with it, but basically it's accepting responsibility for something out here that seems like it's gone astray, whether a relationship or an event that we regret or whatever. It's asking, what is my part in this? Asking that universal consciousness or divine consciousness, what is my part in this? And doing the deep work within, and then speaking the Hawaiian prayer. I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you, thank you. And that prayer, both for myself and my clients, has been just utterly transformational for so many different kinds of experiences. And I just want to throw that out there as one of the many beautiful tools. And I usually connect it with the principle of the spiritual mirror in relationships. And you all started kind of with those points in Jung's quote with the psychological rule. The principle of the spiritual mirror in relationship is basically the same thing. And we can apply it to the situation we're in as well. And that's just, it's along with the Hawaiian prayer. It's, if I have a problem with something outside me, what is my matching energy, consciousness, vibration inside me that I need to transform in order to allow the shift outside me to occur? So I hope we can continue this, because I love all the contributions, and I think there's, that we can do something together. That thought excites me, and And I'm super grateful for all of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol.
Well, on the note of creating something together, I'm wondering if there's any archetypes or Hindu mythology about relating to the earth as a lover, as a partner that we can co-create with, versus just not just, but rather than a mother that still has a hierarchical, like her children to take care of, or Kali the destroyer. Like, I'm just wondering if there's another idea out there.
There's Gaia.
Well, Gaia, yeah.
And she's not like the others. She's the real mother in the earth. Mother Earth.
Yes, but she's still in the mother archetype. I'm wondering about like lover.
You know, we have to create our own archetypes in this age. As Craig was pointing out, we need to reinvent our myths and re-signify our myths. You know, just like the mother can also be powerful as well as, you know, kind of nurturing. So too, the feminine can be the lover. You find in the Mahabharata, for example, the figure of Draupadi, you know, who in a sense is that, you know, the lover who inspires all the fighters, all the brothers, so to say, to do the right and co-create in that sense the realm of the reign of the truth. And so these are images that we need to find and reinvent and recreate for ourselves. And I think it's your contribution is what you said is wonderful. And I think it's really necessary to think of the earth as lover and recreate with her, you know, the glorious earth that we would like to see.
There's so many different, including that one, there are so many different ways that earth and nature show up, aside from mother, which is a big one, but, you know, changing woman and all the other earth, you know, alien Nigeria and things like that. But one in particular that I'm thinking of is Pele of Hawaii, who there are stories about her interacting with human lovers, but they have to be tough because she's fierce and unpredictable, and they have to actually be able to stand up to her a bit and have their say, you know. So and then there's others where I'm thinking of one in particular. There's a story from Japan in which a young man named Yosoji gets lost, and he's kind of a young guy, and somebody young and beautiful shows up. A woman shows up and says, "Let me guide you. I can show you the right way to go." And so she gets him unlost, and then he turns to her and says, "Thank you." And he's got this big crush on her, so you can tell from the story that he's interested in her. And he says, "Who are you?" And instead of answering him directly, she drifts away. And as her spirit goes out into the air, she hovers over Mount Fuji, and he suddenly realizes that she is Mount Fuji. So there are stories like that in many traditions too.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, and my understanding in Hinduism, it is said, and Debashish, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we can relate to God in multiple ways. So as not only as parent, but as our child, as our lover, also as sort of like a master slave, which has a problematic connotation, of course, now. But yeah, so I just wanted to add that, and also that so many of the deities are represented as a pair of lovers, right, in the Hindu tradition as well as in other traditions. And I think that that's been lost in a lot of the, you know, in the Abrahamic traditions, and also in the ways in which a lot of people think about the Indic traditions too, is just through the masculine god, or maybe the solo feminine god, but they forget the importance of the fact that they're paired.
Yeah.
And then to whomever asked the question, this isn't necessarily, it's a little bit tangential maybe to what this talk is about, but there's a movement that called ecosexuality, and Professor Michelle Marzullo in Human Sexuality I think has written about this, which is really all about relating to the earth as a lover. So that might be something that interests you as well.
True. Interesting.
Other questions, comments?
Hi. Yes. Thank you, Debashish and Craig. I'm really deeply inspired by your talk, and look forward to watching it again. Maybe I'll start with the feminine aspect. My understanding of archetypes comes primarily from the archetypal astrological perspective. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. And it seems as though what's happening in many ways is this differentiation of the autonomous self through the modern period, through the Enlightenment, you're mentioning Debashish. And there's a Saturn-Pluto conjunction right now in the sky, and it's square to Uranus. And if you look back in history, Saturn-Pluto was present at the fall of Rome. It was the Saturn-Pluto-Uranus was there at the French Revolution. At 1930, at our last Great Depression. And interestingly, Martin Luther had Saturn-Pluto, and this idea of sovereignty, of defining oneself. Saturn is the boundaries, and Pluto is the evolutionary principle, or our nature as well, and like how we control nature. There's so many layers to what's happening here, but it seems as though the evolution of our species has carved itself out and multiplied in such a way that our sovereignty, our autonomy is bordering up against the edge of the world, the environment. We're not actually free to do what we want to do at any time in relationship to the whole. The whole is pushing back, like the symbolism of the virus is like kind of a compensatory function. And it seems as though that differentiation, we had to separate ourselves from the cosmos. We had to separate ourselves from the astrological worldview and from the gods and forge this autonomous identity and discover the three outer planets, Uranus and Pluto, we didn't know about, and the depth of the human psyche that's also been forged in the modern era. And the astrological perspective can do something. So much of what you said, Debashish, made me think of like our identity and how understanding our identity in relationship to the whole is what the astrological perspective does. And it does it in a way that brings us together as a community. It allows us all to see how we are participating in the symbols, the archetypal symbols, how we are co-creating with them, and ultimately how we can help each other see ourselves in relationship to the whole. And yeah, I guess that's kind of what I wanted to say. It just seems like this is a real moment in time where we have an opportunity to address and potentially to evolve and to move into a new relationship where we recognize a new level of wholeness. Yeah, so thank you so much. I was really I really look forward to listening to it again and taking notes. So thank you.
Thank you, Chad. Yeah, and I think what you're referring to, I see it as, you know, the pre-modern world was a world of correspondences. It was a world of sympathetic magic where we saw mirrored in the cosmos psychological realities. And I think the constellations, the stars are a system like that, you know, and I think that's what you're talking about. The fact that we can build a relationship of that kind again, which we've lost in a sense, and that can help us to find the possibilities. We can look for signs in a sense that guide us towards achieving what we need to do today. Yeah, and I think I agree with you. We need to build those new relations.
Speaking of which, wasn't it great when we sent that probe out to Pluto and it was revealed to have on its surface a gigantic heart shape.
Yeah.
Just love that.
Absolutely.
Robert.
Now, well, you both have access to many, many myths. And whenever I hear one of you relate them, one or another, I'm always inspired and excited. And I'm thinking, what do I make of that? And so my question is, do either of you have a criterion when you look at a myth for its likely sort of efficacious significance? Do you have a criterion that makes you say, this is a myth we can build on, we can put into our conscious and unconscious life individually and together? What would be the sort of the test of your recommending one myth over another?
Great question. One thing I look for is whether it's come up for a group of people and why. So there are Navajo stories that are being retold right now as the tribe continues its long battle for sovereignty. In this case, against mining companies, which is an old story on reservations, In ancient Navajo tales, there are two brothers who protect the people. One's name translates as killer of alien gods, Nayanaskani, and then the other born of water. And so they're thought to be necessary to clear the land of the monsters so that people can live safely there. Now, nobody, to the best of my knowledge, nobody sat in a council and said, we should resurrect these two gods because we kind of need them in order to support our fight for sovereignty. It just sort of happened. They just sort of started talking about it in the way that there were elders at Standing Rock who did the same thing, and the stories were just up for them. So one thing I go by is, do groups of people spontaneously feel seized to not only retell the old stories, but to actually make them relevant in terms of struggles that we're going through? And then another thing that I tend to look at is, are the images and themes of the story so kind of in your face relevant to our time? And one of the ones that comes up for me is Aristeas, the original, from Greek mythology, the original beekeeper who came home to his hives one day and all the bees were gone. And so this story was told many centuries before we had a term like colony collapse disorder. And then when you read the story further, or you hear a storyteller tell it and they say, well, Aristeas screwed up. He pissed off the underworld goddesses, the earth goddesses. So he was told that he, first of all, had to apologize to them. And then he had to sacrifice meat, these big altars, to sacrifice. And then once he had done all these different things, then the bees eventually came back. So when a story is that up, when it fits that perfectly and people start telling about it, it makes me think that maybe it can offer something.
So the story essentially comes of its own accord because it's wise and it knows what's needed.
Yep. Yeah. When I teach storytelling, I often convey to people the fantasy that the story has its own psychical being. It is a being, And so some stories like being told by you and some don't. So in my case, there's a joke that I've tried to tell for years that I've stopped telling because every time I tell it, nobody laughs except me. And then there's other stories that people seem to like hearing them from me. So for me, what that says is the joke telling me, I'm not your joke. You should stop telling me, And I think that applies to groups of people too.
That's a great answer. Thanks.
Yeah. I usually, one of the things that Craig said, I really liked and it meant a lot to me, which is that these myths have got many different possibilities. They're very plural. Even more, all stories have got these many dimensions to them, so you can reinterpret them and retell them in different ways. And I think myths are even more so because as you look at them, they allow you to tweak them and look at them in different ways. And I'll find that certain stories will appeal to me at a certain time. And as I look at it, it becomes more relevant. And I know how I can retool it, so to say, for the time. And I think that's part of the function of myths, to be able to become relevant for your own times.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I have just another thing that I wanted to ask, if that's okay. You know, speaking about myth and story, I'm wondering if anyone can offer something along the lines of, you know, that collectively and individually, like we sort of chose all of this stuff together and individually, you know, so that nothing that is happening, nothing that has occurred, nothing that will happen will be anything new under the sun, so to speak. You know, it's something that we've already chosen in a sort of grand gesture, you know, at the beginning, and then, you know, renewed those vows or those commitments or those covenants, you know, intermittently. So yeah, I mean, you know, again, not looking at religion or anything in particular, but just something that might, you know, empower, you know, oneself and us collectively, because I think it's the most empowering thing, you know, because then you don't need to be saved, and you don't have anyone to blame. So yeah, if you can offer anything along those lines, I'd be really, you know, grateful.
Yes, Sami, I'd like to say that this is actually pretty central to most of the ancient Hindu tradition, particularly the Upanishads, built around this idea. And one of the really important Upanishads, the Isha Upanishad, ends with these kind of lines. I mean, it goes through an entire journey with regard to truth and falsehood, but it ends and it talks about, you know, the revelation of truth. But it comes back to the present and it comes back to the human. It ends with the line, "O soul, remember that which was done, remember." And that which was done is really a kind of a memory function. It's really the fact that you did it.
Yes.
It isn't anybody else that did it. Just remember the fact that you were at the origin, that you were part of the decision that made the cosmos unfold into exactly what it is right now. And you are in it right now to fulfill the purpose that you're supposed to fulfill right now. So it's that remembrance that brings us, you know, both into responsibility as well as into destiny. It's
Thank
not
you so much. I'm getting goosebumps.
Yeah, it's both deterministic as well as, you know, volitional.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I'm reminded by what Debashish said of a story about Indra, who in some ways can be a very narcissistic deity, and, you know, having someone build his palace over many eons and it's never enough for him. And so finally Vishnu shows up in the form of a boy, which is an interesting choice when you think about the common and, you know, in that appearance. And Vishnu comes to have a talk with him, and he says, Indra says, "Oh, isn't this a great palace I live in? It's so grand, it's so complex, it's so beautiful." And Vishnu says something, I don't remember it exactly, but it's something like, yeah, every time you do this, you build a pretty big one, you know. And as he's speaking, there's this line of ants that are going across the ground, and Vishnu laughs and he goes, "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but, you know, each one of those is an Indra, because you keep doing this, you know." And so from that point forward, Indra goes, oh, you know, and then he begins to transform, you know, because he doesn't want to keep doing the same thing over and over again.
That's good.
I wanted to, Mark Zakarian just wrote a bit ago. It seems to me we are experiencing a sense of loss, a sense of confusion of moral source, the ontic logos. We seem to have lost a sense of the sacred, a respect of the sacred. How can we develop a mainstream logic to help people see this psycho-spiritual ecology and show value?
How can we, so I missed the last part of that. How can we develop
a mainstream logic to help people see this psycho-spiritual ecology and show value?
My old therapy teachers hammered into me that you have to meet people where they are. You have when you work with a client, you have a vision of where you would like them to be, always understanding that it's your vision, and and they may surprise you and it may be completely unsuitable for them. But in any case, you have to be with them wherever they are. And so I'm thinking about Jeffrey Keel, who is both a Jungian analyst and a climate scientist, and he tells stories when he talks about our relationship with the earth. So here's story again coming up, you know, that stories reach people in a way that sometimes arguments don't. So the thing about story too is you don't always have to interpret it for people. And in fact, people will bring their own interpretations. And even if theirs fundamentally disagree with yours, what remains in the end is the story, and the story stays with them. So somebody might not interpret the Aristeas story the way that I tend to do, and that's fine. A myth is alive to the extent that it can bear multiple viewpoints. But what remains in the end is that story, and it works on people. So that's one way that it can happen.
Yeah, I'd like to say that, you know, I mean, the images of an ontic logos and a mainstream logic, sometimes it has too Apollonian a feel.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's like when Nietzsche talks about the birth of tragedy, he contrasts Apollo and Dionysus. In a way, we are in the Dionysian age. We want Dionysus to journey into the underworld. We want the plurality of Dionysus, where he dismembers himself. And I think we need to realize that we are in a process of reconstituting the dismembered self again and again. And I think those images, in a way, are more appropriate to our times than the ontic logos. But also, I mean, if we talk about something which we need to develop and which we need to propagate, I think that's where the academy comes in. And I think these are the kinds of conversations, and these are the kind of disciplines in the departments of CIIS that can form that kind of image for larger numbers of people. It'll never become the mainstream logos, but it could over time really have an impact, and as Craig was saying, in different ways to different people. It's not going to be some single standard version, but it'll be a story retold in different ways, in infinite ways, in infinite minds. So I think we have to look at it as that possibility.
Yeah, one thing I would add too is that our great storytellers are a resource that we sometimes neglect. There's a lot of different psychological ways of talking about restoring our conscious connection to nature, but if you read Alice Walker, it's all in her work. There's an essay that she wrote in which she talks about how when she notices the wildflowers that bloom outside of her house, then the following year they double, as she puts it, in profusion and brilliance. So right there is the conversation in the sense of reconnection. She's just doing it for us and showing us how, you know. So I think that's one of the reasons that we emphasize the humanities, you know, psychology's and spirituality's relationship to the humanities. They work together.
Thank you. I want to invite any sort of last questions as we're wrapping up here. I did have one. It was, you know, to this sort of statement, don't immanentize the eschaton, which is kind of an interesting phrase that sort of suggests not to, it seems, sort of impose the apocalypse, right? And there's a kind of, I think, conservatism, sort of worried about, you know, these sort of activists who are kind of, you know, trying to create their utopia, which ultimately sort of devolves into a dystopic reality. And so on the one hand, you can see that in sort of evangelical communities who are sort of doing everything they can to precipitate war in the Middle East with the intention of using that to catalyze the rebirth of, or the return of Christ. So I'm wondering how you can maybe offer a criterion of, you know, with the guiding principles that you left us with these tasks, how can we differentiate between, say, a wanting to sort of create this, you know, the second part of the apocalypse, the more of the ascension to a new community. How can you differentiate between that in a more relational way that sort of encompasses all of the principles that you've been talking about, and more of an egoic imposition, if that makes sense. And I guess where I'm thinking about this is you have somebody like, Jesus Christ, this figure who sort of seems to be the figure of redemption and salvation, right? And then you have somebody like Simon Magus, who in a lot of ways is the same figure, right? It's still a salvational figure, still a figure who is, a magician leading people towards freedom, etc. And in the mythologies that are more appreciative of him, he has a very important relationship with the feminine as a way of sort of freeing the feminine to sort of destroy the sort of oppressive world, right? And yet he becomes the archetypal figure for egoism and everything that's wrong with this tradition ultimately. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you recognize the difference, say, between an egoic desire for transformation and a relational desire for transformation? Is it only in hindsight? Is it, I don't know. So that's my question.
I think it's an important question. I think not only as a question, I think it's a rhetorical question to some extent, because what you're talking about has to do with relationality. I think that's what the key word for all that we're talking about is relationality. It's plurality and relationality, and it's seeing the fact that each individual is in that sense the divine, but a divine that doesn't know its own borders. So in other words, we can never predict the divine. The divine cannot predict itself because it's radically infinite. It has no horizon. So from that point of view, if one makes the mistake of thinking that something that one knows or feels is the ambit of the divine, it's only a fascism. And that's the real fall of all these figures that actually create an image of the divine that really is a limited, is a bound infinite, not the radical infinite. The radical infinite only comes about through the recognition of relationality as the ground of realization, in our times at least.
To respond in a kind of a concrete way, just something that I use for my own life. Well, two things. One is I get asked to be on think tanks occasionally for ecological ways forward. I just got asked by one recently. And their project is utopian in the sense that they want to make a difference in the world. And I think they're usually of good intent, So what I always do is their board, if they have a board of directors or a board of something, I go to that page and I look at who those people are. And then I go to the leadership page and I look at who those people are. And if they're all white people, I don't join. And I tell them why. I tell them you need a plurality of viewpoints here and you don't have one, right? So one question I always ask is, in any utopic project, is there a plurality of viewpoints? And if there's not, then there's a problem. The second thing is, you mentioned Simon Magus, and of course, he's a figure from Gnosticism. And one of the points that are made in the Gnostic stories is that the universe kind of reminds me of Star Trek in a way, the idea of infinite diversity and infinite combinations, that the universe comes about from a unity emerging into plural expression with powers that are referred to as aeons who always work in pairs, usually masculine, feminine pairs. But that everything that we know is a complexity. It's built out, it's built from basic patterns, but in an incredible variety. And so I love that story about Simon Magus working with Helena, who is his feminine counterpart. They actually mirror two different poles of the ultimate ungendered God that happen to express themselves as masculine and feminine in some stories, But that image of variety and diversity coming out of something that's basically simple is another one that I always look for in things like this. Where are the complexities? How are we tending the pluralities and things like that? when it goes in the other direction, you know, turning it into a master plan or whatever, then I start getting really worried. So that's my own kind of thumbnail way of navigating through it.
Thank you. Well, if there are no other questions, and I don't see any hands or anything, I'm going to invite you two to say any last words, and then we'll call it a night. Craig, Debashish, any last thoughts?
Dream together. That's it.
That's a good last word. Beyond that, I think silence is the best word.
All right. Well, before we give you and each other some silence, I'm going to invite everybody to just give a round of applause for our two speakers here. You can either unmute yourself or what have you, but thank you so much, Craig, Debashish, and thank you all for coming out and being with us this evening. Next week, we've got Rick Tarnas, Lily Falconer, Laura Machete, and Chad Harris, who is still here. Thanks, Chad, for the question. They'll be talking about the current world transits and reflections and strategies. So thank you all, and we will see you next week. Appreciate it.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. And